August 7, 1942. Before dawn, the sea around Guadalcanal boiled with ships, gray silhouettes stretching across the horizon. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 61 had arrived under the cover of darkness, carrying thousands of Marines who had never heard of the island they were about to invade. Few could even pronounce its name. But by the time the sun set that evening, Guadalcanal would become burned into history and into the nightmares of the Japanese soldiers who would soon defend it. At 0600 hours, American cruisers opened fire. The shells screamed overhead and crashed into the coastline, throwing up geysers of dirt, smoke, and shattered palm trees. Minutes later, landing craft splashed into the surf, packed with Marines from the 1st Marine Division, the first major U.S. offensive of the Pacific War. Many of them were young, barely out of high school, clutching rifles slick with sweat. They had been told the island was lightly defended, that only construction troops were present. They expected resistance, but not a major battle. When they stormed ashore at Lunga Point, there were no bullets waiting for them, only silence, the kind that makes a soldier nervous. The jungle loomed like a living thing, dense, wet, and alive with unseen movement. The air was thick and heavy, full of insects and the stench of decay. It was a far cry from the training grounds of California. For hours, Marines moved cautiously through the trees, weapons ready, expecting an ambush that never came. They found scattered Japanese equipment, tools, and half-built airstrips, proof that the enemy had fled inland. But as the day wore on, an uneasy feeling spread among them. The jungle swallowed sound. Every branch seemed to twitch, every shadow seemed to breathe. That night, as darkness fell like a curtain, the real terror of Guadalcanal began. The Japanese had not vanished. They were watching. From deep within the jungle, small patrols of the Imperial Japanese Army observed the new American invaders. They were veterans, many from the elite 17th Army, hardened by years of fighting in China. They were disciplined, stealthy, and utterly unafraid of death. But the jungle itself was an enemy even they could not control. The constant rain turned foxholes into swamps. Leeches clung to skin. Malaria stalked every man. The heat was suffocating, the nights crawling with insects. It was as though the island itself wanted everyone dead. For the Japanese soldiers, Guadalcanal would become a place of horror, not because of American firepower, but because of the jungle, the endless darkness, and the sense that death could come from anywhere at any moment. On the second night, the first real contact occurred. A Marine outpost near the Matanikau River reported strange noises, branches breaking, whispers, then silence. Moments later, flares lit the sky. Shadows darted through the undergrowth, followed by the staccato bark of rifles. The Japanese had struck in small teams, fast and silent, cutting throats, throwing grenades, and vanishing into the darkness before the Americans could react. By dawn, 8 Marines were dead. The jungle swallowed their killers without a trace. It was the first taste of what would become known as the night battles, a new kind of warfare where the Americans, inexperienced and terrified, faced an enemy who seemed to appear out of nowhere. But the Japanese soon realized something else. The Americans were learning fast. Within days, Marine patrols began pushing deeper into the jungle, moving in small, silent units, ambushing Japanese scouts with sudden bursts of fire. They learned to read the jungle, how to track footprints in the mud, how to listen for silence instead of sound, how to fire only when certain of a hit. The once confident Japanese began to notice something unsettling. The enemy was no longer afraid. By the second week of the invasion, the U.S. Marines had secured the nearly completed airstrip, which they renamed Henderson Field. It became the beating heart of their defense. From there, American aircraft, Wildcats, Dauntless dive bombers, and later P-400s began flying missions over the island. Every Japanese attack on Guadalcanal would now face not only jungle warfare, but also air supremacy. The Japanese high command in Rabaul was stunned. They had believed the Americans would retreat as soon as serious pressure began. Instead, the U.S. had dug in. Orders went out immediately for counterattack. Reinforcements, veterans from the Ikiki detachment, boarded transports to retake the island. They were told the American presence was weak and disorganized. They were wrong. As the first Japanese reinforcements landed on the night of August 19th, they were met not by a disorganized rabble, but by an enemy waiting in silence. Hidden behind logs and camouflaged positions, Marines listened to the sound of boots in mud, whispered commands in Japanese, the faint clink of metal. When the moment came, the jungle erupted in gunfire. Flashes lit the night like lightning, mortars thumped, grenades exploded. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the sickly, sweet rot of vegetation. The Japanese charged with bayonets, shouting bands high. But the Americans didn't panic. They fired in controlled bursts, disciplined, relentless. The attack collapsed in less than an hour. At dawn, hundreds of Japanese bodies lay scattered along the riverbanks. Few Americans spoke as they moved among them, collecting rifles and checking for survivors. The silence of the jungle returned, heavier than before. For the first time, Japanese troops faced something they had not expected. Americans who could fight in the dark, in the mud, in the jungle, and win. It was the beginning of a campaign that would turn Guadalcanal into a place of terror. For 6 months, the island would become a nightmare of starvation, disease, and relentless battle, where the jungle itself became a weapon, and fear was as deadly as bullets. The days that followed the first Japanese counterattack blurred into an endless cycle of rain, mud, and fear. Guadalcanal was not just an island, it was a living nightmare. The jungle was thick and suffocating, its canopy blocking out sunlight so completely that noon often looked like twilight. Every step forward meant pushing through vines, mud, and swarms of insects that seemed drawn to the smell of sweat and blood. The Marines had dug deep defensive lines around Henderson Field, trenches filled with water, foxholes collapsed under the weight of rain, and supply lines turned to sludge. Yet even as they endured the elements, they held their ground. Each day, planes from Henderson thundered into the sky, searching for Japanese ships trying to slip reinforcements ashore. The airfield was the lifeline of Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled it controlled the island. At night, the Marines learned to fear the sound of the jungle. The Japanese came like ghosts, silent, invisible, and merciless. They infiltrated lines, whispered in English to confuse sentries, and attacked from behind. Knives flashed in the dark, and throats were cut before alarms could be raised. For the Americans, sleep became a luxury. For the Japanese, the darkness was their greatest ally, but the jungle betrayed both sides. The Americans fought exhaustion and malaria. The Japanese fought starvation. Their supply lines were shattered by American naval and air superiority. Japanese destroyers, forced to deliver men and rations by night, could carry only what was essential. Ammunition arrived, but food rarely did. Within weeks, Japanese soldiers began eating coconuts, roots, and sometimes even the flesh of the dead. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Disease ravaged their ranks. Yet their discipline never wavered. Even half, starved and sick, they attacked with terrifying resolve. On the night of August 21st, Colonel Keanu Ikiki, furious that his earlier detachment had been wiped out, led what remained of his regiment against the Marine perimeter near the Ilu River, later called Alligator Creek. It was supposed to be a swift annihilation of the Americans. Instead, it became one of the most one-sided defeats in Japanese history. At 0230, flares illuminated the riverbank as hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged screaming across the sandbars. The first waves were mowed down by machine gun fire. The Marines, dug in and waiting, had pre-sighted their weapons for just such an assault. Every burst found its mark. Mortars rained shells on the crossing, and soon the air was filled with smoke, screams, and the acrid stench of burning flesh. By dawn, the attack was broken. Bodies littered the river's edge, tangled in mangrove roots. The water ran red. The few survivors crawled back into the trees, their once proud regiment destroyed. Of Ikiki's 900 men, fewer than 150 made it back to Japanese lines. Colonel Ikiki, realizing the enormity of his defeat, performed seppuku beneath a palm tree. For the Marines, it was proof that courage alone could not defeat firepower. For the Japanese, it was the first realization that the Americans were not the weak-willed adversaries they had been told to expect. The myth of American softness died that morning on the sands of Alligator Creek. But even as the Marines celebrated their victory, the jungle reminded them that nothing came easy on Guadalcanal. Within days, the rain returned. Malaria spread like wildfire. Men shivered in their foxholes, their skin yellow and fevered. Flies swarmed over rotting corpses that no one had the strength to bury. The smell hung over the camp like a curse. As weeks passed, the Japanese adapted their tactics. They stopped frontal assaults and began fighting as shadows, snipers hidden in trees, lone scouts who picked off sentries, infiltrators who attacked supply depots. Every rustle in the brush could be an ambush. Marines moved in small patrols now, clearing jungle inch by inch, their nerves stretched to breaking. One Marine sergeant described it in his journal. "You didn't see the Japs. You felt them. The jungle was their weapon. You'd look up and see eyes in the trees, or hear something behind you, and by the time you turned, it was over." The Japanese were experts at camouflage. They melted into foliage, painted faces with mud, and built bunkers disguised as termite mounds. Their patience was unnerving. They could wait motionless for hours before firing a single shot. But the Americans began to adapt once more. Scouts learned to spot unnatural shapes among the trees, to listen for the faint metallic click of a safety catch, or the smell of tobacco smoke drifting through the leaves. By September, the Marines were no longer just fighting for the island, they were becoming part of it. Their skin was streaked with dirt, their uniforms torn, their bodies lean and hard. They learned to stalk the enemy through the rain, to move silently through the underbrush, and to strike without warning. The jungle that had once been their enemy was now their teacher. But the Japanese still held one advantage: the night. Under cover of darkness, they continued to strike. Mortar shells fell into American camps, setting tents ablaze. Grenades rolled into foxholes. Flares turned the canopy into a twisted shadow play of death. The screams echoed across the ridges and rivers. Every dawn revealed new horrors. Bodies hanging from trees, mutilated corpses, heads mounted on stakes. The psychological toll was immense. The Marines hardened themselves, but some would never recover from what they saw. Despite it all, the Americans held Henderson Field. Each day they survived was a victory. The Japanese launched raids by land and air, but the Marines dug deeper, built stronger bunkers, and waited. Reinforcements arrived slowly, bringing food, ammunition, and more men. The balance was shifting. Still, both sides knew the battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. The island seemed cursed to consume everyone who set foot on it. Disease, exhaustion, fear, and death, these were the true rulers of Guadalcanal. As September turned to October, the Japanese prepared for a new offensive. Their generals promised to crush the Americans in one decisive strike. They called it Operation Ka. But the soldiers who had fought in the jungle, who had seen the Americans endure, no longer shared that confidence. The whispers spread among them. The Americans were not like the Chinese or the British. They did not break. They did not run. And worst of all, the jungle itself seemed to fight on their side. By mid-October 1942, Guadalcanal had become a graveyard of ambitions. The Japanese still believed they could drive the Americans into the sea, but every plan they made fell apart inside the island's suffocating jungle. They had been trained for bold offensives, for lightning, fast attacks supported by artillery and air power. But on Guadalcanal, the jungle devoured strategy. Nothing moved fast here. Every ridge, every river, every creeping vine conspired to slow men to a crawl. The Japanese 2nd Division arrived under torrential rain, their uniforms soaked, their weapons rusting before they could even fire them. Sea convoys that brought them were bombed by American aircraft from Henderson Field. Those who made it ashore found little food and no shelter. Rations spoiled in the humidity, rice turned black with mold, and men began to hallucinate from hunger. Still, orders were clear: attack and destroy the Americans at all cost. The new assault would come along the Matanikau River, dense forest, uneven ridges, and choking heat. The Japanese commanders, confident in their discipline and experience, believed a nighttime attack would crush the American perimeter. But what they didn't know was that the Marines had already turned the jungle into a fortress. Hidden among the roots and shadows were interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests disguised as fallen logs, sniper positions hollowed into termite mounds, and booby traps made from grenades wired to vines. The Marines had become predators of the jungle, and the Japanese were walking into their lair. On the night of October 23rd, the assault began. Rain poured down in sheets, muting every sound except the distant crash of waves. Japanese soldiers crept forward in near silence, bayonets fixed, their faces painted dark to blend with the forest. They moved through mud waist, deep, whispering prayers to their ancestors. For a moment, the only light came from flashes of lightning tearing across the sky. Then, out of nowhere, the darkness exploded. Flares hissed upward, turning night into blinding white. Machine guns opened fire from three sides. Mortars followed seconds later, their shells bursting in wet thunder. The Japanese ranks dissolved into chaos. Men fell screaming into the mud, while others stumbled forward blindly, firing into the shadows. The disciplined soldiers of the Empire were now fighting ghosts they couldn't see. The Marines fired short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition. Every gunner had his lane of fire marked by stakes hammered into the ground. They had rehearsed this ambush for days. When the first Japanese wave faltered, the Americans shifted targets with precision, an invisible choreography of destruction. Within minutes, the clearing was a slaughterhouse. The rain mixed with blood and dirt, forming a red swamp. Still, small groups of Japanese pressed on, crawling toward the American lines. Some threw grenades, others lunged with bayonets, shrieking their final war cries. But the Marines met them with knives, rifle butts, and bayonets of their own. Combat turned personal, primitive. Men fought face to face, screaming, slipping in the mud as thunder rolled overhead. One Marine later said, "The jungle ate the noise. You could hear them breathing before you saw them. You didn't shoot, you just fired at sound and movement." By dawn, hundreds of Japanese bodies lay tangled in the vines. The survivors dragged themselves back through the forest, leaving weapons and comrades behind. For every Marine killed, 10 Japanese had died. Yet the Americans didn't celebrate. They knew another attack would come. It always did. 2 nights later, it did. This time, the Japanese tried to flank the Marines through an area called Edson's Ridge. It was the high ground overlooking Henderson Field, the heart of the American defense. If the Japanese took it, the entire airfield would fall. Under cover of darkness, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Japanese Regiment crept through the rain, hoping to surprise the Americans. But Major Kenneth Bailey's Marines were ready. Listening posts had already detected movement. When the first enemy scouts appeared, the jungle erupted again in light and sound. The battle raged through the night. Marines fired until their rifles overheated, then switched to captured Japanese weapons. Grenades rolled down the slope like rain. The screams of the wounded echoed through the valley. For hours, the Japanese came in waves, disciplined, relentless, each one dying closer to the top. But they could not break the line. By sunrise, Edson's Ridge was carpeted with bodies. Marines staggered among them, numb, blackened with gunpowder and blood. They had held the ridge, but at a terrible cost. The Japanese who survived began to whisper something they had never said before. They had faced Americans in China and the Philippines, but these men were different. They moved like the jungle itself. They fought in silence without fear. Some Japanese officers wrote in diaries later recovered from their bodies, "The enemy is skilled in the night. They are not human." Even Japanese intelligence officers at Rabaul were alarmed. Reports described American patrols that appeared suddenly, ambushed with deadly accuracy, and vanished without a trace. The traditional Japanese belief that Americans could not endure hardship began to crumble. The Americans didn't just endure, they thrived in the same hell that was destroying Japanese soldiers from within. Meanwhile, life in the jungle grew worse for the Japanese. Disease claimed more men than bullets. Dysentery, dengue, malaria, every step was agony. Corpses rotted where they fell, their stench clinging to the air. Men too weak to fight lay in the mud, whispering prayers to die before hunger took them. The Americans suffered too, but their supply line, though strained, still functioned. They received quinine, canned rations, and reinforcements. The Japanese received nothing but promises. By the end of October, the Japanese army on Guadalcanal was a shell of its former self. What had begun as an offensive to reclaim the island was turning into a slow extermination. The jungle had chosen its victim. Yet Tokyo refused to accept reality. New orders came, attack again. Victory is near. The soldiers who read those orders looked around at the corpses, at the steaming jungle that reeked of death, and realized something their commanders never would. Guadalcanal was no longer a battlefield. It was a sentence. By November 1942, the island had turned into a nightmare that refused to end. The heat never broke, the rain never stopped, and the smell, sweet, rotten, metallic, never left the air. Both armies had long since stopped caring about anything but survival. But for the Japanese, the jungle had become more than an enemy. It had become a haunted thing, whispering their doom with every rustle of leaves. At night, they said, the jungle screamed. Sometimes it was the wind through the palms, sometimes the cries of wounded men lost in the darkness. But soon the Japanese soldiers began to believe that the island itself was alive, that the spirits of the dead were hunting them. Patrols that ventured too far never returned. Lanterns vanished in the dark, and only the crackle of rifle fire answered their fading shouts. The Americans had learned to use this terror. By now, the 1st Marine Division had become masters of jungle warfare. They moved like ghosts, their faces streaked with mud, their rifles wrapped in rags to muffle the metal. They ambushed patrols, dragged bodies into the undergrowth, and left no trace. The Japanese could not see them, could not hear them, only the jungle swallowing their comrades whole. During the day, the Marines hunted. At night, they waited. One patrol, led by Sergeant Red MacGregor, crept through a mangrove swamp to intercept a Japanese supply column. The air was heavy with insects, the water black and foul. For hours they lay still, their bodies half submerged, listening to the faint clatter of boots on wood as the enemy crossed a fallen log bridge. When the first soldier stepped into the open, MacGregor whispered, "Now." The jungle exploded. Rifles cracked in controlled bursts. 2 machine guns opened fire from hidden flanks. In seconds, the Japanese column disintegrated. Men fell screaming into the mud, their crates of ammunition spilling into the water. When the firing stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. The Marines slipped away without a word, leaving behind nothing but bodies and shattered bamboo crates. When a Japanese search team arrived hours later, they found no footprints, no shell casings, nothing. Only corpses staring up at the canopy. To the starving soldiers of the Empire, it was proof of what they already feared. The jungle itself was killing them. Disease finished what fear had started. With their supply lines shattered, the Japanese lived on handfuls of rice or nothing at all. Men collapsed in their tracks, their bodies so thin their ribs showed through torn uniforms. Some boiled grass and bark for soup. Others searched the dead for canteens half full of rainwater. Officers ordered their men to keep fighting, but their words rang hollow in the stifling air. One diary recovered after the war contained a final entry, written in trembling kanji: "We have no food. The enemy comes in silence. Even the trees hate us." The Americans, though exhausted, still fought like professionals. Their tactics were methodical, relentless. Artillery observers mapped every inch of jungle near Henderson Field. Whenever scouts spotted movement, mortars fell within minutes. Machine guns were repositioned daily, so no enemy could memorize their fields of fire. Even the pilots flying from Henderson learned to spot the glint of bayonets hidden in foliage and strafed without mercy. The Japanese began to call Henderson the starving field. Every time they attacked, they lost more men. Every time they retreated, the jungle took the rest. On November 12th, the Japanese launched one of their final attempts to seize the airfield. 3 columns advanced through the jungle, carrying what ammunition they could still find. They moved at night, hungry, delirious, their boots squelching in the mud. But the Americans had intercepted their plans through radio reconnaissance. The Marines waited with interlocking fire zones and pre-sighted mortars. When the first shots rang out, the jungle lit up like lightning. Mortars crashed, grenades burst, and tracer rounds carved glowing arcs through the darkness. The Japanese charged anyway, half starved, half crazed, bayonets flashing. They screamed as they ran, voices cracking with exhaustion, until they met the wall of fire that cut them down. By morning, the ground was littered with corpses, weapons half buried in the mud. American engineers counted more than 600 dead in front of the Marine lines. Of the Japanese officers who led the charge, none survived. The Marines didn't cheer. They simply cleaned their rifles, replaced ammunition, and waited for the next attack. Even victory had lost its taste. Guadalcanal was eating everyone alive. Men spoke less and smoked more. The jungle's sounds, buzzing flies, dripping rain, the croak of frogs, became maddening. Corpses decayed where they fell. Every breeze carried the smell of death. The Japanese still tried to fight, but their attacks grew weaker. Some soldiers stumbled into American lines waving makeshift white flags, too weak to speak. Others crawled to streams to drink and never rose again. American patrols began finding diaries, letters, and photos of families in Tokyo and Osaka, tokens of men who had once been soldiers but were now shadows. Even the Japanese officers began to understand. Their army was not fighting for victory anymore, it was fighting for survival and losing. By December, the American reinforcements from the U.S. Army had begun arriving in strength. Fresh troops, better supplies, more artillery. The tide had turned. The jungle that had once shielded the Japanese now betrayed them, revealing their movements to aircraft and patrols. For the first time, it was the Americans who controlled the night. The Japanese soldiers still alive could hear the distant hum of engines from Henderson Field every evening, followed by the rhythmic shelling that marked another failed attempt to retake it. To them, it was the sound of inevitability, a slow drumbeat of defeat echoing through the trees. They had come to Guadalcanal as conquerors, now they were prey. By late December 1942, the Japanese army on Guadalcanal was no longer an army, it was a collection of dying men. Their uniforms hung loose on skeletal frames. Their boots had rotted away, their rifles rusted, and their strength was gone. The soldiers called the island Jigo, Ku no Shima, Hell Island. The few survivors of earlier assaults huddled in caves or under fallen palms, shivering in the endless tropical rain. Many were too weak to stand, their skin gray with disease, their eyes sunken and glassy. They no longer spoke of victory, they only whispered of food. Their once proud regiments had been reduced to ghosts. Of the 20,000 Japanese troops sent to retake Guadalcanal, less than half could still fight. The rest were dead, dying, or delirious from hunger. Some had not eaten in days. Others chewed grass, leaves, or strips of leather torn from belts. When corpses began disappearing from the camps, no one asked questions. Meanwhile, the Americans grew stronger. Reinforcements from the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division had arrived, bringing food, fresh ammunition, and artillery. The Marines who had survived the first months of hell finally had relief. Yet even they looked worn, haunted by what they had seen. Guadalcanal had changed them. Every day, aircraft from Henderson Field filled the skies, bombing Japanese positions and supply lines. At sea, American ships hunted Japanese destroyers trying to deliver rations by night. The desperate runs the Japanese called the Tokyo Express. But most of those missions failed. Food that reached shore often rotted in the humidity before it could be distributed. The Japanese soldiers began calling their supply dumps ghost kitchens, empty tents where meals were remembered but never served. Desperation twisted discipline into madness. In one instance, an entire company disappeared after venturing into the jungle in search of food. Days later, a reconnaissance patrol found their bodies, some half-eaten. Hunger had stripped away humanity. Even the officers could no longer hide the truth. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, wrote a final report to Tokyo that bordered on despair. The men cannot continue. The jungle, the disease, and the hunger are greater enemies than the Americans. But Tokyo refused to listen. Orders still came to attack, to hold the island, to die for the emperor. The Americans didn't need to attack anymore. They let the jungle and starvation finish what their bullets had begun. Patrols found Japanese soldiers dead at their posts, still clutching rifles, their fingers locked by rigor mortis. Others crawled toward streams, only to collapse before reaching the water. At night, the Americans heard strange noises drifting from the jungle, soft weeping, delirious singing, prayers in Japanese. Some soldiers couldn't bear to listen. They called it the crying forest. In one grim encounter, a Marine patrol stumbled upon a group of 10 Japanese soldiers who had built a small fire. The Marines aimed their rifles, but the Japanese didn't move. They just sat there, staring at the flames, too weak to fight. One of them saluted before collapsing. The Americans lowered their weapons and walked away. There was no victory in killing men who were already dead on their feet, but mercy was rare. In other areas, fighting continued. The remaining Japanese who could still hold rifles launched suicidal raids on American lines, charging blindly through the jungle. They screamed banzai, with voices so thin and cracked that they sounded more like cries than war shouts. Machine guns tore through them before they ever reached the trenches. By January 1943, the Japanese High Command could no longer deny reality. The island was lost. A secret evacuation plan, Operation Key, was approved. Under cover of darkness, destroyers would land on the northern coast and rescue as many survivors as possible. But even that plan seemed impossible. The Americans controlled the air, the sea, and the land. The jungle, too, belonged to them now. As the evacuation began, the Japanese soldiers who remained felt no relief. Many were too weak to walk to the extraction points. Others refused to leave, too ashamed to face their commanders after defeat. Some simply wandered into the jungle, never to be seen again. For the Americans, the sudden silence was unsettling. Patrols that once faced constant ambushes now found only empty camps, half-buried rifles, and abandoned diaries. One Marine officer wrote, "They didn't run, they just vanished. The jungle took them back." Those diaries told stories of unimaginable suffering, men eating insects, carving messages to their families into tree trunks, and praying to die in battle rather than from starvation. One entry read, "The enemy fights like shadows. We can no longer see them, only hear their guns. The jungle devours us. I fear death less than I fear the darkness." Even after the last Japanese ships slipped away, the island remained haunted. The jungle was full of bones. American engineers clearing ground for new positions uncovered skeletons tangled in roots, rifles still in their hands. The Marines had won, but it didn't feel like victory. The cost was too high. Nearly 1,500 Americans had been killed and thousands more wounded or sick. Guadalcanal had consumed both armies. Yet, in the end, it was the Japanese who had been broken, not just militarily, but spiritually. They had come believing that courage and devotion could conquer anything. But courage could not feed a starving man, and devotion could not stop disease. To the survivors evacuated back to Rabaul, the memories of Guadalcanal were unbearable. They spoke of an island cursed by death, where the enemy fought like phantoms and the trees whispered in English. One soldier, delirious with fever aboard a rescue destroyer, murmured his final words before dying, "The jungle has eyes. It never sleeps." For those who lived, Guadalcanal became a warning written in blood. The age of the human wave was over. The jungle did not reward bravery, it devoured it. February 1943. For the first time in 6 months, the jungle of Guadalcanal was silent. The gunfire had stopped. The smoke had drifted away. The last Japanese destroyers, their decks crowded with starving men, had vanished into the night. When dawn came, the Marines found only footprints in the sand and rusting helmets half buried by the tide. It was over. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War, had ended, but no one cheered. The Americans who walked among the abandoned Japanese positions did not feel victorious. They saw skeletons in tattered uniforms, bones gnawed by animals, and letters never sent. They smelled the rot of 6 months of death. The island that had once seemed like paradise was now nothing but graves and mud. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal was more than a defeat, it was humiliation. They had believed themselves invincible, guided by the divine spirit of Bushido, but the jungle had stripped that illusion bare. The Americans, whom they had called soft and cowardly, had endured hunger, disease, and terror, and had refused to break. In Tokyo, the news of the evacuation was softened with words like strategic withdrawal. But everyone knew the truth. The Emperor's army had lost its first great battle of the Pacific. The myth of Japanese invincibility had died in the swamps of Guadalcanal. For the Americans, the island became a legend. The Marines who survived were hardened beyond recognition, lean, silent, and scarred by what they had seen. Many could never forget the faces of the Japanese they had killed, or the comrades they had buried under the jungle's dripping leaves. Some left crosses made from branches. Others left nothing, afraid the jungle would take even that. Guadalcanal had changed everything. Before this battle, the Japanese Empire had advanced without resistance through Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines. Their armies had marched like thunder, crushing everything in their path. But Guadalcanal stopped them. It proved that the Japanese soldier, no matter how brave, could bleed. It proved that the Americans could stand, could fight, could win, but the cost was staggering. More than 7,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Over 30,000 Japanese died, most not from bullets but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The island had claimed them all. Even after the fighting ended, the jungle kept its secrets. American engineers clearing ground for airfields found bodies tangled in vines, helmets fused with roots. Dog tags hung from branches. Sometimes they swore they could still hear whispers in the rain. War correspondents who visited Guadalcanal called it the Island of Death. Pilots flying overhead said they could smell it from the sky. And those who had fought there said the island never really let them leave. In the months that followed, the Japanese survivors who made it back to Rabaul were too broken to speak. Many could not bear to eat. Some died within days of evacuation, their bodies unable to recover from months of starvation. Those who lived told stories of madness and horror, of comrades disappearing into the trees, of screams in the night, of Americans who seemed to merge with the jungle itself. They said the enemy was not human, but something born from the island, cold, patient, and merciless. Historians would later write that Guadalcanal marked the turning point of the Pacific War. From that moment on, Japan was on the defensive. Its empire began to shrink, island by island, until only the homeland remained. The American victory opened the path to the Solomon Islands, to the Philippines, and finally to Japan itself. But for the men who fought there, Guadalcanal was not about strategy or empire. It was about survival. It was about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the edge of endurance. It was about hunger that turned friends into strangers and fear that lived in every shadow. Decades later, veterans who returned to the island said it still felt haunted. The jungle had reclaimed everything, trenches, bunkers, even the bones. Flowers grew through helmets. The rusted barrels of machine guns jutted from the soil like gravestones. And at night, when the wind moved through the palms, it sounded like distant voices, soft, sorrowful, and unending. Some Americans left small flags, some Japanese lit incense and prayed. Both sides cried. Because no one truly won on Guadalcanal. The island took them all. In the years that followed, military historians studied every detail of the campaign, how air superiority decided the outcome, how logistics and supply chains crushed Japanese hopes, how American discipline adapted to jungle warfare. But the soldiers who had fought there didn't speak of tactics. They spoke of rain that never stopped, of nights when you couldn't tell where the jungle ended and your fear began. One Marine veteran said, "The island was alive. It didn't care who you were. If you stayed long enough, it owned you." The Japanese veterans said the same in their own way. They called it the island that devoured armies. As time passed, Guadalcanal became a symbol, the place where two empires met, and only one walked away. It showed that war was not just about courage or weapons, but endurance, patience, and the will to live. When the final memorials were built decades later, both American and Japanese names were carved into stone, side by side. The jungle had taken their bodies, but history gave them remembrance. Today, if you walk the beaches of Guadalcanal, you can still find rusted helmets half buried in the sand. Sometimes, after heavy rain, bones rise to the surface, pale against the dark soil. And if you stand very still, you can hear the wind move through the palms, soft, mournful, almost human. It sounds like the island is whispering, "Remember us,